Cool. Okay, so welcome everyone online and everyone in the room. Welcome to the Wellington OAuth meetup. It's been a while since we last had a meeting, so great to have a good turnout. Thank you very much for coming. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Matt Cotterell. So Matt works at ZX Security. Oh, yeah, you've got the logo. Cool. I can mention where you work. And does pen testing and security consulting and checks people's AWS configuration and all sorts of other fun stuff. And last month he spoke at the AppSec NZ conference on the same topic. So OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 and various other things. Tonight, probably go for about 45 minutes.
Yeah, the last one, it was supposed to be, we squeezed it into half an hour, which was a bit of a challenge on my part. So drag it out a little bit more and hopefully it will be a little bit less fast and frantic.
Cool, yeah, so yeah, hop up and grab yourself a soft drink if you want some. You need to go to the men's, it's just through that door that's wedged open. You need to go to the ladies, just grab Hako or me or Paul, and we'll show you the way there. Other than that, let's give Matt a round of applause.
Cheers. Yes, like I was saying, this is a half-hour talk, which fortunately get a little bit longer with now. So you're not going to quite see the same frantic panicking as you saw if you were at the conference last month. So that's probably a good thing. I will also try and keep the accidentally having my back to the audience to a minimum because I was a little bit excited about things and kind of forgot where I was positioned. So nice intimate crowd will be a little bit easier. So yes, I'm from ZX Security. Yeah, I do a lot of auth stuff, cloud stuff. I've come from a sort of a .NET Microsofty background, so do a lot of that stuff as well. Love ridiculous stock photos. It's like, you know, little criminal hacker dude coming out of an iPad, just hysterical to me. So yes, but yeah, today I'm here to present sort of what we kind of want what the internet's sort of moving towards, but there's a lot of weird moving parts with it that I kind of hoping to demystify. But go back in time a little bit, back in the 90s. Does anybody here remember Yahoo when it looked like this? But that's the thing, it's pretty simple to log in, really. What we have here is just a good old username and password. Password was the secret bit, and that was it. It's all you needed to remember. And the whole thing with it was pretty much, this was the password between the user and a service, right? It was never given to any other service. The secret was between you and Yahoo, or you and Google, or you whatever. And that was because your stuff was on the same service. So if you wanted to access it, you needed that secret. But that's the thing. Other services couldn't access your stuff. If you had some photos on Yahoo, you didn't really want to be giving away your password to Google so they could access your Yahoo photos, because then Google could access everything, or whatever. If you've gone into a photo printing place and they said, "Oh yeah, cool, just give me your Google account details, same one as you use to get your Gmail, and we'll just print your photos for you. You just point out which ones you are. Just put your password on this notepad." It's very uncomfortable for fairly obvious reasons, right? So the other thing with passwords is they're kind of actually hard to store. They really suck when it comes to just like the actual security of it from a storage point of view. The service, they have to do all sorts of things like hashing it, salting it, iterating it, all these sort of technical complex things to protect users in case you get breached. The users themselves, they can't do any of this kind of technical stuff as well, because it's A, it's very, very tricky, but also B, it doesn't technically work for the way that they need it as well. They have to use something like a password manager to encrypt it so that they can go get it back out again. Or more likely, they just reuse the same password over all places. I mean, raise your hand if you've reused a password between two different websites. I work in a security consultancy. Everybody's done it, trust me. Anybody who didn't raise their hands are liars. And that's the thing. It's just like, the other thing as well is, like I said before, you can't give this to anybody else to use. It grants unlimited access to your account. If you gave that password to someone at the photo printing place, they can access your emails. That's not good. Also, resetting the password breaks access for all services. If you gave it to various different places so they can get access to your photos and tweak them all update them or whatever. You reset your password, they can't access it anymore. So that's not good either. So fast forward to 2021, we've still got all these problems now with data breaches leaking our passwords, too many passwords. We've now got thousands. God, my password manager is probably up to well over 1,000 things now. It's just ridiculous. We want less things to have to remember or have to manage, you know. We also want these services to work together. There's certain things where it's like, okay, you've got Google Photos, but there's some services out there that do things that Google's Photos can't do. And I want to give them access to just the photos, nothing else. I don't want them to get access to other things as well. But I also want to revoke it later. Maybe I suddenly decide I don't want this third-party service. Maybe they got sold to some other company and I don't trust them anymore. I want to revoke that. I want to do this easily as well. So that's sort of where we're coming into this whole idea of OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, and JWT. These are possibly technologies you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, but they're to do with authenticating you with another service and trying to federate a lot of this kind of identity, or this sort of management stuff. So we've got OpenID Connect, which is an authentication system. What it is it allows you to log in with an external provider, and it tells those services that you're logging in with through, say, Google or Facebook or whatever, who you are, and it also lets you choose that kind of information you want to share. Maybe you don't want to share your email address, but maybe you do want to share your phone number. And it's kind of an extension on top of this other thing we've got here called OAuth 2.0, which is more around the authorization aspect. It lets services access some of your data. So you can say, hey, cool, I want the service to access photos, but nothing else. And it works in conjunction well with OpenID Connect. So these two things kind of merge together a little bit these days now. And what ties it all together a little bit more is JWTs. These are sort of, you can think of these as a little bit like a replacement for your password. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail soon. But it's used to prove your identity as a temporary token, kind of like a temporary password to access these resources. And it's all secured with cryptography and other weird math magic. So yeah, coming back to the idea, we've got this Photo Viewer Plus. You edit your photos on a cool modern website and it uses all sorts of awesome new fonts like Papyrus and this thing I got from Office 95, this background. Now it has this cool new sign in with Google button, which is way simpler. All you do is you click it. If you're not signed in with Google already, you're going back to Google. You're actually logging in with Google. You're not on that website anymore. Saying, hey, would you like to continue to photoviewerplus.co.nz? Sign in with your Google account. Type in your email, you give it some permissions, you say, hey, I am okay with you viewing, modifying, and deleting my photos. Nothing else, not my Gmail, just that. And then you come back, it says, cool, thank you for that. You're logged in as user@gmail.com. Please wait, we're retrieving photos, and then bam, photos are there. But how did that all just work? We were at Google is a completely separate thing. My cookies with this don't exist on my cookies with Google. How did they work together? Some magic happens here, and this is what we're sort of going through. We've got a user here, and they've got a browser, and we've got our photoviewerplus.co.nz server. We go off to it and say, hey, I want to see my photos on your website. And it goes, who the hell are you? I don't know who you are. So instead, it kicks us off to account.google.com. These are just examples. There's all sorts of other websites that do it exactly the same way. You give your password to account.google.com. Remember, we're not giving that password to anybody else. And then they generate these two tokens. They are called, and so they pass it back through our browser, back to photoviewerplus.co.nz. These are called, they are an identity token and an access token. The identity token is for photoviewerplus.co.nz to use itself. It consumes this thing, it goes, okay, cool, I trust whatever comes out of account.google.com. It has some nice cryptography and whatnot around it, so we know that the user hasn't modified it. And yep, cool, that definitely looks like user@gmail.com. Second part of it is getting the photos. So there's a separate server, which is api.google.com. Okay, don't know whether that's the URLs, just an example. And it uses the access token, sends that off to api.google.com. It checks and goes, yeah, no, that looks legit. It's definitely come from photoviewerplus.co.nz. This is for this particular user, and it lets you access these photos. Here they are. And that's how we saw them on the thing. So these two tokens we were talking about before, we've got an identity token and an access token. Identity token tells photoviewerplus.co.nz who Matt Cotterell or whatever user it is. It includes some information about them, how they logged in, and maybe even some other things like groups they belong to. Maybe they're part of an admin group in your in your organization, and that has extra access or something along those lines, or that lets you get better permissions on the website. There's also the access token, which lets PhotoViewer post OpenID briefly. Usually these tokens only last about, say, 15 minutes or so, or up to about 2 hours. Access my data on some third-party server. So api.photo.googles.com. So it lets you do photos, read and write, but only read-only access for favorite post, something along those lines. And these are called scopes. We'll go into that a little bit later. But yeah, oh my God, there's 3 servers now. What happened to the old thing of just like username, password to one server done? It's like, oh, we've got browser, server, it's easy to remember. Now we've got 5 different things. What's what? So we'll go through it, we'll break it all down. And I know this is going to sound a little bit simple, but trust me, it's really, really important to understand these things. The key thing we've got here is resources. This is your stuff, essentially. And these things can be like your Facebook posts, your Twitter tweets, your photos, your phone numbers, or even, your email address. Things about your identity or things about, things that you own. These are things that you have. But, who owns the resources? The resource owner or the user. You'll see these 2 terms used quite interchangeably a lot of the time. Whenever I say resource owner, think user. It's usually sort of a good way to think about it. This is people. This is just the person who's interacting with the stuff, the person who the resource actually belongs to. The next part is the client. And this is the app or the server that we're kind of talking to. A good example of this is like, say, Reddit. It's when you try and log in, one of the things it will show you is continue with Google, continue with Apple. You're not logging, your username and password doesn't exist in Reddit in this case. It exists over with the other thing, but this is the client. But it doesn't have to be a website either. Sometimes it can be a desktop client or a mobile client, desktop app or a mobile app. Or even weird things like your TV or your scales at home. It's generally the thing. There's a lot of weird IoT things. My scales do this, actually. They try and log in with Google. It's weird.
The number's way bigger on my scales.
Oh, so, yeah. That's right. I sort of tweaked mine ones down to, so it looks a little bit best like this. But yeah, generally the client is, you can think of it as the thing with the login button. It's kind of a nice way of looking at it. And then the thing you log into is your identity provider or authorization server. Again, OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 use different terminologies because they had different goals with it. But yeah, think of it as the identity provider is the one we're going to generally try and work with, but they're quite interchangeable. This is the thing that has the login form, right? This is the thing that says, hey, what's your username and password, or what's your username and your fancy little USB ID token thing, or whatever, whatever the thing is you authorize, you authenticate with. The place where you prove who you are. And then the last thing is the resource server. This is where your stuff is. So this is api.photos.google.com. I don't really have a good photo of that. It's just a big thing of the URLs. Where the stuff is that the client wants. So it's a good way to sort of break out those 3 servers. I know it sounds a little bit sort of simplifying sort of things, but this is where I see a lot of, when I'm doing a lot of the authentication and authorization testing at work, this is where I see a lot of the confusion come up, is where those separate concerns are and who's responsible for what. So it really helps you guys sort of break down and actually have a good idea about who's responsible for what. That's right. That's supposed to come out at a fun time. Right, cool. And last thing, we were talking about tokens as well before. There's 2 general ways we can sort of think about tokens. We've got reference tokens. This is kind of the thing you're sort of probably more familiar with back in the sort of days of web development, where you've got a random string. It's usually just a reference to something in a database. So you can kind of think of it like the ID token that you'll see in a lot of a session ID token that you'll see, a cookie that you'll see in a lot of like web applications. It's just a reference to a thing in a database, and the database says, cool, this session is for this user and they're logged in until this time or whatever. It references some other piece of data. So it looks like that generally, whatever. But then you've got this idea of self-contained tokens. They have the data inside them. So you will actually be able to, in the cases where they're not encrypted, you'll be able to actually see the actual data inside them. So it'll say inside it, this is for user 129 or whatever. And this user is named such and such, blah, blah, blah. in order for it not to be tampered with, because a lot of the time the browser might be handling, well, the browser shouldn't be handling it, but something could happen to it where it is modified or altered. It uses cryptography so that it can prove that it came from login.google.com or whatever, and hasn't been altered on the way. Sometimes they're also encrypted, so you can't see the information inside of it, but that's always the case as well. And they can be verified offline. The idea is that it's really good for APIs and stuff because you don't have to go and hit a database every single time an API call comes in. You can just check it right there in your memory and go, yep, cool, the crypto says it's cool, therefore I'll just trust it. And so an example of that is JWTs. So if you've seen JWTs before, they look a bit weird. It looks like just gibberish at that stage. It's kind of like, okay, whatever. But if you start sort of breaking it down a little bit, you can actually see the color. If I colorize it a little more there, you can actually see there's 2 strategically placed full stops there, which actually break this up into 3 sections. And as you can see, there is these actually have separate purposes. The first part is a header, and that is used for basically describing how this JWT has been made and what makes it up. The second part is the actual data that we're talking about before here. So sub, that could be the ID of the user there, the subscriber. We interchange the terms all the time and it drives everybody nuts. Name, that one's fairly self-explanatory. And then there's this IAT, which is issued at. So this is the timestamp of when this token was issued. You usually see a lot more things in here like an expiry and all sorts of stuff, but just for simplicity's sake, just made it small. And then the last part here is just a signature. This is that cryptographic data there where if you change any of the bits in any of this, then the signature won't match and it will just be discarded and not trusted. Yeah, that's what a JWT looks like. Okay, so lots of concepts here. Everybody's probably a little bit confused. Let's go back a little bit and just go actually into how this sort of works. So the main flow, so there's a lot of different ways that you can use OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect and all that sort of stuff. The one that you're most commonly going to come across, especially in website sorted settings, is this idea of the authorization code flow. This is a kind of a 2-step process involving logging in some other server so they can access some resources. First step is that the resource owner logs into the identity provider, such as Google, using their browser, and it gets a authorization code. This is a special code that can only be used with the client. The browser then gives it to the client, and the client then does its own request response in HTTP to the Google server to get access and ID tokens. I'm skipping over a few details here, but we just want to try and keep this quite simple, just so it sort of gets everybody gets the sort of idea of it. So we'll go through that in, with a bit of a diagram. We've got the user here. They use the Google password here on, against Google account.google.com to go and get an authorization code. And account.google.com issues the authorization code. It says, cool, here it is. You can, the client can use this later to go and get the actual token. And the user passes it on to photoviewplus.co.nz. The HTTP request actually looks like this. In fact, you can actually throw that in your browser, not this exact one, but something similar to it, and it will basically just show the little Google login form. So there's 5 parameters that you have to specify here. The first one here is use the authorization code flow type. You'll see that change for some of the other ones that we'll provide soon. There is a client ID. This is the identifier that sort of identifies the client. So photoviewplus.co.nz will have this internal identifier. There is a redirect URI, which is basically when this succeeds or if it fails, this is the URL you need to go and send the user back to once they're done with logging into Google. There is scopes, like I mentioned earlier. You have certain permissions, well, sort of like permissions. It's sort of a reduced amount of access that this thing will get. And then you've got the state, which is, if anybody's familiar with a cross-site request forgery token that often happens in a lot of web applications sort of things, it serves a similar purpose. It's basically the client will make one up. It goes off to Google or the other identity provider, and the same value has to come back. Again, skipping over some details, but we're trying to keep this simple at this stage. The response to that request, once the user's logged in and everything, is actually, it's not HTTP 200 OK. I should just realize it's actually wrong. It's supposed to be a redirect. So anybody who knows HTTP can admit, it's redirects you back to photoviewerplus.co.nz with this authorization, with the code here, shadows, and the same state that we showed earlier. And that just goes back to the client, and that slips up and go for step 2. So going through a few of these things here, there's really important for the security aspects of things that we go through 3 of these parameters because they're really important not to stuff up. The first one is this redirect URI. We don't want this redirect URI to go to some place that isn't photoviewerplus.co.nz or some trusted URL. So when we go to the, let's go back. When we go to account.google.com and we say, hey, this is the client ID, it'll have a list of redirect URIs that we've supplied that have said, these are the ones that we trust to be used with this client ID. If somebody comes to account.google.com and says, hey, I want to go and log into this thing, but actually send me over to this evil website over here once you're done, that's kind of bad. We don't want the evil website to get that authorization code in the end. It's one of the sort of security things we're trying to protect a little bit. So if you can imagine if you're not checking for this, you could go to this URL, you could send somebody this URL instead. They go to the thing, that is still public information. That is photoviewerplus.co.nz's client ID. But we're actually, once we're done logging in, we go to evilbadsite.co.nz. So what does this look like? Looks perfectly normal here. Account.google.com, there's the client ID, it's public information, it's in the URL bar, anybody can grab it. But once they log in, actually it goes to evil bad site. Once we're successfully logged in, we can make the evil bad site look like Google. It says, oh, actually you've typed in the wrong password. Just type it in again, just one more time. You check the URL bar the first time around, so you don't need to check it again. You just type it in, right? And now evil bad site has your password. Even worse than that as well. On another extent as well, they also get the access, the authorization code. They're not supposed to get access to that. There's no need for them to have access to that. So that's why we try and make sure that we're redirecting to the right place. It's a safe list that we set up there. So add redirect URLs to a safe list, and the client ID should only allow the return to certain URLs. So they have to be a specific list that you've defined as an administrator of your client with Google. So yeah, that's normally set up in Google's like admin panels or whatever if you're trusting them as the identity provider. Second one is scopes. This is that part where we're talking about here where we can limit down what that thing is allowed to access. And it comes up as you're logging in saying, hey, give access to photos, but not anything else like that as well. So we can put in scopes in here, such as we've got this one here, it says photo read, so only read access, and also this premium feature called promote photo. So you can pay some money to go and have your photo higher on a listing of whatever. I don't know, just making stuff up at this stage. So it's important to go through this. There's a really key thing that I've seen done wrong in a few instances where, say we've got this API.google.com has all of these different permissions here. These are 4 examples. We've got photo write, where you're allowed to write and delete photos. Photo read, where you're allowed to read the photos. There's this premium promote photo thing, which is available for premium Google Photos users. Again, making shit up. And for system administrators of this API, there's also this admin server shutdown function here, which they can use through the API because they're really good at security. I don't know. The user permissions, this is what the user is allowed to do. They don't have the premium service, so they're not allowed to promote photos or whatever. They're just a regular user. The scopes that we've actually requested here are photo read and premium promote photo. So the key part of this is that the only thing that should actually be allowed to be done is this bit in the middle here. Just because the scope's in there doesn't mean that they automatically get access to it. You still have to check your ACLs. You still have to check your access control stuff to make sure that the user's actually allowed to do that with that token, given that token. So yeah, scopes limit what the access token can do. So the client can't do more than the resource owner is allowed to. Just because they're given the token, they can do more than that. Also, the resource owner can limit what the client can do. So as you saw before, we gave it read access, but not write access. Scopes can also limit things in the identity token as well. So you can sort of see where it says what the resource owner can decide what personal details the client gets. So sometimes you'll see a little tick box saying, I do or don't want to share their email address. Depends on the implementation of how they've done the identity provider, that they might sometimes give you the option to make it optional. but that's part of that whole aspect of it as well. And the last thing is the state. This is the CSRF token kind of thing that we were talking about before. Basically what happens is the client decides on any non-guessable value. It just has to be something that's just not, it's not like an incrementing number. We guess what the right value is for a certain person. The identity provider simply returns it back with the authorization code, and then the client has to check, is it a state that I created? Is it something that I made? So it has to track that. And also, is it the same thing, is it the same browser I gave it to? So does it match the cookies from when I sent them off? Did they come back the same person, sort of thing? Again, skipping over some details, but that's largely the key aspect of it there. Without it, you could do something where you've got what's called a session fixation attack, where a victim will click a link with an attacker's own authorization code. So say they log in attacker.gmail.com, whatever, but at the point where they get the authorization code, instead of going back to the browser, they just hold on to this and they send it off to somebody else. And they say, oh, yeah, I've got some really cool photos over here. You should go totally check this out. Give them the link. That'll go and log the victim in with the attacker's account. They may not know this, and then they'll start, I don't know, maybe uploading some photos to the attacker's account, thinking that it's their own account, or something along those lines. There's all sorts of different facets of session fixation attacks. Definitely look up the OAuth resources for more information about that, but that's a sort of a general idea of what you can do with it. So it's important to make sure that it's checked as well. Okay, cool. So that's step one. Just wanted to make sure we got some of those things there. It's really important to get those bits right. Last part is just the step two, where the photoviewer+.co.nz goes directly to account.google.com. This is kind of a back-end kind of HTTP call. Doesn't involve the user's browser at all, where they exchange that authorization token, sorry, the authorization code for the two tokens we mentioned earlier, the identity token and the access token. Identity token says, yep, cool, that looks like a legitimate user. They're logged in and the thing's discarded. The access token can be used to get api.google.com to go and get photos. So that looks like this. This is the second step here. As you can see, there's that code. The grant type is authorization code. It's slightly different, but yeah, again, still part of the same step. The redirect URI has to be included in there as well, along with the client ID. And the most important part is the client secret. The client ID also has one or more, sometimes, secrets associated with it. This is something that never gets revealed to the browser, so that the browser itself can't exchange the authorization code to go and get these tokens. Only the client can do it. And once all these parameters are sent off to Google, it'll give it the correct tokens. So, and that's what the response looks like. As you can see, there's the access token there, there's our JWT. And there's also the ID token, which is here as well. It includes a bit of additional information as well. Sometimes we might want the website to have persistent access to this thing. Remember, those tokens only last for about 15 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how they're configured, if they're done right. If they're longer than that, make it smaller. And then you've got this refresh token as well, which you can use basically it's kind of like repeating that second step, but instead of using the authorization code, you use this refresh token to get a fresh token, so you can maintain access to Google Photos. And usually that's a reference token. Sometimes it's a JWT. It can be either. And that is the part where if you go into your admin panel, whatever, you can see applications you've authorized. When you revoke it, that's the thing that gets revoked, essentially. So now that access token, that refresh token, can't be used anymore by that application, and in 15 minutes, access tokens don't work anymore because they've expired, and you can't get new ones. Cool, clear as mud. There's quite a lot going on in there, and it does sound like it's like a little bit overwhelming. And this is the thing, auth is hard. There's a lot of people that lament about this going, oh my God, can't we just use passwords? It's so much easier. But there's a lot of things that we enable by doing this more. A lot of libraries and SDKs and things will handle this for you as well. So it's just really important to kind of go through all of these details and actually sort of understand at a high level overview what's sort of going on so you can understand the process. But a lot of these libraries will kind of help you through this process, so it's not quite that confusing. I am taking a lot longer than I was doing as well, so I'm going through a bit more of the details. If you see my talk that I did at AppSec, it was a bit more frantic. I was rushing through it all. But yeah, it's a wee bit involved in it. But yeah, what about things that aren't websites? So we've actually got a couple of other weird sort of scenarios where this code, the authorization code flow, doesn't work. Such as, what if there is no user at all? What if it's just photo viewer plus.co.nz wanting to check its billing details with Google. Like, it's got an account with Google. It doesn't need to have a user to do that. It's because it's its own account as well. It's sort of a service-to-service kind of thing. Also, what if the user doesn't even have a keyboard? What if they're not in a browser sort of situation where it's just like a thing where you can easily navigate a username and password into a thing? Exactly. Very, very much. So we'll go through that very shortly. That's exactly it. Or, if it doesn't even have a screen at all, like it might be a little photo frame, or it might be your digital scales, whatever, that definitely tell me I'm 30 kgs higher than I actually am. So we've got these, so this is the one we introduced before. We've got the code authorization code flow. But there's two more. There's a client credentials flow, and there's a device code flow. They look very similar to the existing ones, but they have some slight differences. There's actually two others which you might come across as well. There's implicit flow, and there's resource owner password credential flow. If you've worked with these before, you may have come across these. These have been deprecated. The new version of OAuth 2.1 and whatnot is actually removing these from the standard as such. Probably still see implementations using them. We're going to ignore these because they suck for various reasons. If we get a little bit extra time, I might go through them, but we'll, for now, we'll just focus on these three because these are the only three you should be using these days. First one is authorization code flow. As I say, resource owner wants to give client access to the resource server. So mobile apps, web, desktop clients, anything that you can type into a browser or browser like that. Client credentials is where a client wants to access the resource server, but there's no resource owner involved, there's no user. So it's server to server kind of stuff. And then we've got device code flow, which is where a resource owner can't easily auth with a web view. So like IoT, smart TVs, or a CLI, or something like that. Client credentials, this is the real easy one. It's quite simple, it's only one step. Basically, goes to here and says, hey, here's my client ID and secret. And this goes, yeah, cool, here's an access token. Then it can use the access token to go and get billing details or whatever. There's no user involved, so don't have all that complexity around jumping between backwards and forwards with authorization codes and all that sort of jazz. Yeah, so it'll be like a client secret. Hard code. Well, yeah, hard coded. Yeah. And, yeah. Without user interaction, it's generally generally when you're authorizing the client itself to something. So there's no person that's logging in. There's no resource owner. There's no that sort of thing. The resource owner is the client essentially, sort of thing. So it's getting billing details from api.google.com. Doesn't need a user. It's got a user client ID and secret. Therefore, that sort of thing. Device is a user. Yep. Not a human user. Not a human user. It's like this is where it gets all very fuzzy, doesn't it? But that's the thing. It's generally when you're seeing computers talking to computers, that kind of thing. So, so we've got basically the first thing that happens, like I said before, client ID and client secret go off to Google and using the client credentials type, and it says, I want billing and licenses access. And then Google just simply goes, yeah, that client ID and secret looks good. Here's an access token. And then you can use the access token. Quite nice and easy. Second one is a little bit more interesting, and this one we're seeing emerge more and more along what with like IoT stuff, talking to the internet, smart TVs cropping up, all that sort of stuff. We can't really easily navigate a login. And that's not supposed to be there. Kind of looks like this. You may have seen this if you've ever tried to log in with a smart TV to, like, say, YouTube or something like that. It just says, hey, scan this QR code or go to this. It doesn't work. Actually, I think it does work. I think it says something stupid, but I don't know. I can't remember. Grab the slides. Tell me what it was. I can't remember. And it says, do this or go to a specific URL and then use this code when it's asked. And then you type in the code and then it shows you the login page. So an example of this is where we've got, say, a digital picture frame. We want those photos from Google Photos or whatever to show up on this little picture frame. But it's got no keyboard, it's got no mouse, all that sort of stuff. So what the digital picture frame does is as soon as it can connect to the internet, it goes over to Google and says, hey, I need to log in a new resource owner. Don't know when they're going to turn up, but I want to log them in someday. So it goes, yep, cool, no worries. Send the user to account.google.com/device and use this code. And so I know that this code is for this particular for this particular device. And it goes, cool, is it done yet? And I was like, no, of course it's not done yet. It goes, okay, cool. Is it done yet? No, it's not done yet. So it's doing polling in the background. It's constantly saying, hey, is this code being used yet to log in a specific user? And then someday a user comes along, scans the QR code and says, hey, I came here from a QR code, and here's the code that I got given by the QR code to log in. And Google says, okay, cool, who are you? Please log in. So it does the login dance and says, yep. Well, in the meantime, still polling in the background. And it's saying, cool, I'm Google Photos Lover 89, my password is blah, or whatever. I consent to this digital picture frame getting photo read access to my resources on API.com. It goes, yep, cool, no worries. You're all logged in, just close the phone, it's all done. In the meantime, this is still polling and saying, hey, is that code done yet? Google says, yes, it is done. Here's a refresh token and access token. And it goes on through that way. So it's all completely out of band, but that polling in the background is what gets you magically logged into your TV or Scales or whatever. And then it uses that access key to go and get the photos. I think I had a little animation. There we go. So yeah, and that's kind of what the device code flow is as well. So it allows you to do the sort of IoT stuff as well. There are emerging code, new other flows as well, but we're just going to keep it at those three, just for simplicity's sake. Yeah, that's pretty much it, really. So that's all of the things.
What are the non-vulnerabilities of the last one?
Sorry, non-vulnerabilities is the last one. So again, some quite similar stuff, especially if you've got, for example, leaking that access the client secret. Sometimes you've got to, like, for that particular photo frame, maybe the client secret is embedded in the photo frame. If you extract the chips off it and start decompiling, reverse engineering the hardware, you might find that secret inside that chip, and then maybe you can pretend to be that photo frame. So there's usually some mitigations around that as well. Don't want to go into that because I'm sure everybody's confused as hell as what's going on there. There's a lot of steps and flows, but we can have a chat about it afterwards and talk about some of that stuff as well. So for DDoS attacks.
Yeah.
Generally, the server it's going to be talking to is not going to be is going to be something that's set up to handle mass amounts of polling sort of stuff. If you can point it to another server, it's going to be in much the same sort of way as a lot of other things as well. But yes, that is actually a particular concern. You've seen things with, like, a few years ago, there was the Morai botnet attacks. That was where a bunch of Internet of Things devices had common, like a default password. A lot of people logged into those things and either rewrote the firmware or configured it in such a way that it was going to just our server that it wanted to take down. And then suddenly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of devices are now trying to, send HTTP requests or do all sorts of, like, send lots of nasty network traffic to one server. And of course, sure, a light bulb doesn't have a lot of power, but a million light bulbs certainly does. So IoT light bulbs, at least, anyway. So yeah, there's all sorts of different concerns around this as well. I'm actually very much planning to do a talk about, and the idea was this was going to be a half an hour, and the next I was going to do another talk that's going to be half an hour long about all of these vulnerabilities. So splitting them up, so like let people digest the first time, and then we can go to the second one. But yeah, definitely do want to go and touch on that side, touch on that part as well. But we'll definitely catch up about some of that stuff as well. Hello.
If you, let's say you're a user and you want to give the service permission to access resources on another service, let's say every week.
Yep.
How do you revoke something like that? How do you, or that's, you're dealing with like a longer lived token?
A longer lived. So
is it okay if you
oh, sorry, I should repeat these. Yes, yeah. Very, very true. Okay, so this question was particularly around, like, if you want to have limited access on a regular basis to a particular a resource server, such as if you were example being like if you wanted to access things only on Friday evenings, for example. A big part of that would be really down to the implementation of those particular servers. Maybe you could configure a scope that says this is Friday evening access only or something like that, and then the resource server would have to interpret it that way. There's nothing baked into the spec specifically that says this access only works during these recurring periods of time. But what you can do, yeah, what you would do is you probably have it so it would be the access token can be retrieved whenever, but this resource server will be programmed to reject it unless it's at a specific predetermined time. So outside of the scope, but yeah, you could probably handle it like that.
And revoking means you won't send a refresh token? Or?
Yeah, revoking would be more of the long-term thing. It's like, I don't want any recurring stuff to happen anymore at all. So you'd have it so it's still a valid refresh token, but the access token you get back from it doesn't do anything, basically. I think that's probably the right way to go and work around it. Yeah, no worries. Any other questions? Oh, yep.
Yeah, if you want to revoke something, but you've forgotten your creds for the master service, you've got your Google account, you've forgotten your creds, you can't reset your password, you've already authorized something.
How do you? Oh, see, now that one's
Let me repeat that as well.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, gosh, yeah. I always just too excited about answering the question. So the question was, if you have forgotten your access, so the identity server, so your account with the identity server, you don't know the credentials for it anymore. How do you revoke access to a third party if you can't log into it anymore? The answer is that's really hard, because you've also got to look at it from a perspective of what if an attacker wants to revoke your access to this thing? So you've still got to somehow prove that it's you. So that's where the password reset stuff comes in and all that sort of jazz as well. So you would say to Google, hey, I forgot my password, please email me. If you've also lost access to the email address from that as well, email support, hopefully they'll help. Maybe they'll have some sort of out of band thing that they can do to verify you. You go, oh, I super promise it was, here's a bill I have from my address, whatever. I don't know. It gets, again, outside of the scope of the thing, but it is a really important thing to think about, is that emergency access to stuff. Yeah. You had one more question as well?
Yeah, so from availability point of view, I'm some clients producer.
Yep.
I decided to delegate authentication, the Federated plugin, to Google or Facebook.
Yep.
And I coded onto my page, the login page, and for example, I decided only Google, only GitHub.
Yep.
And then GitHub is down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not available. So am I locked down forever, or what are the mitigations? What are the strategies here?
Gotcha. So the question was, say we've got a client and it wants to log in with, say, GitHub, and we've got GitHub as the identity provider for this particular thing. And then GitHub goes down. And is everybody logged out? What is the scenario that actually happens in the event that, say, GitHub as the identity provider is offline? The answer for that is generally, yes, you won't be able to log in a lot of the time. And your website will probably go down as well. The JWTs that get issued, generally, because they're self-contained tokens and they can be verified offline, those will still be valid with whatever resource server you're sending it off to, or whatever is along those lines, unless it's, of course, also GitHub, because those servers will be down too in this scenario. They'll still be valid because you can't easily revoke those. They only expire when the time that's encoded inside them says they expire. So those will still sort of work until those need to be renewed again, in which case GitHub's down, you can't use your refresh tokens or whatever scenario you've got there, and in which case, yeah, your users will not be able to access things and you will have outages. It's just something you need to think about with a contingency plan. Ideally, you probably do want that to fail close. You don't want to go, oh, just because GitHub's down, we're just going to let people just authenticate and we'll just trust it, or, you know, or whether we'll just, maybe you had some sort of out of bounds thing where you issue a cookie and you say, cool, you can still use our services, but anything that's with GitHub doesn't work. There's different ways that you can handle that, but generally, yeah, you won't be able to talk to GitHub anymore, and therefore authentication requests will fail, ideally. Over in the back.
So the OpenID 1 had this cool feature that you could put a redirect on your own personal homepage, and it would direct to Google or Facebook, and you can change that.
Yeah.
Does this have a feature like that?
No-ish. It's probably the right way to say it. It's just for the purposes of it, no. There is some extensions that let you do dynamic registrations, which you could probably tie in that make it work a little bit like this as well, where you can have clients that will automatically register themselves to Google or Facebook or whatever as things pop up. But it gets quite complicated at that stage. It's something worth looking into if that is a scenario you want to support, but yes. Just realized I didn't repeat the question. Repeating the question, the OpenID, there used to be an OpenID standard. It was just called OpenID, which makes the whole OpenID Connect thing very confusing. The question was in that original spec, you could just put a URL into a thing. You log in using your mat.wordpress.com URL, and then it would redirect you off to whatever thing you wanted, and it would come back saying this is you at this server, and then you use that for your identity identity stuff. And does OpenID Connect support that as well? Yes, and the answer is yes-ish with that dynamic registration stuff I mentioned earlier. It's an extension to the OpenID Connect scope, and it gets really complicated, and I haven't used it. I wouldn't be able to speak on any authority with it, but you might be able to look into that scenario if you need that. But yes, the reason why the original OpenID spec didn't really take off was because of that whole thing I mentioned earlier. It launched very early when people were very used to the idea of using a username and password, and then suddenly when people came along and it's like, cool, you need to log into this thing using a website address, everybody just got confused. It's like, wait, hang on, the website address goes at the top of the screen, not in the thing, and how do I log in? And they got very confused with it. It didn't get the user adoption it needed, unfortunately. So got rewritten and sort of helped out with OAuth too. Yeah.
Question or comment
Yep.
about the sub or subscriber ID.
Yep.
That this is quite like unique IDs that because you authenticated your user, but you still want to give some user have some user management and do some state in your application, and you need to map this user authenticated to your user in your database. Then this sub is quite reliable to keep against it and not email the sub.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something worth mentioning.
Correct. Yeah. So to repeat that as well. So I mentioned earlier. Let's see if I can go back to that actually, because it was it's really good to show that. Where's our? Gosh, way too many animations in this. I get very excited about PowerPoint animations. Clearly, makes translating this to a PDF completely impossible. Where's our? Oh my gosh, so many slides. This was a mistake. There we go. Here's our job. And one of the claims, so the full claims inside it, is the sub, or you can think of it as the user ID. This is Google's or Twitter's or whatever user ID for that particular user as it comes back from your identity provider. The question was, the comment was basically, use this to pin against, not say an email address. And that is absolutely correct. One of the things that can happen sometimes is people change their email address. One of the things that can happen sometimes on that is that somebody else steals that email address and now they've got access to this account on photoviewplus.com or whatever. So pin it to something that doesn't change, like that user ID. So, which is the sub claim is part of the standard for this. You'll see it quite commonly in most of the implementations there, but you'll occasionally see some other things as well. Like I know if you're using Azure AD as an example for authenticating your enterprise or whatever using OpenID Connect, they'll have other things like the UPN, which is usually looks very much like an email address, but often isn't. That does sometimes change, I think. So be aware of when, well, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure. I'm not super familiar with Azure AD in that particular thing. I have to look it up in the docs. But just be very aware that sometimes these claims change. So if you are using that as the thing that identifies somebody, so you go, oh, cool, I've seen that email address before. I'm going to use that as the thing that maps the Google user to PhotoViewer Plus user in the database or whatever. If it changes, just be aware that somebody else could end up assuming that identity. So use something that doesn't change like sub. Yeah.
You wouldn't usually worry about that if you use some kind of corporate identity provider.
Yeah, sometimes they would have a different, they might have a different claim that you want to pin against as well.
Yeah, sure.
Again, just make sure that it's not something that ever changes. People's names change as well, and other facets of their identity do change as well. So make sure it's something that is absolutely immutable for that particular user.
So what, a DNA sequence or something?
A DNA sequence also works. You could just put the DNA claim inside the thing and then it just spits back, what is it? I don't know how much DNA is. It'd be a very big jot.
Is there maximum length?
Sorry?
Is there maximum length?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't know. I don't think there is, but again, there'll probably be a lot of libraries that'll just sort of crap out it after a few kilobytes or whatever.
Crash
saving the image thumbnail in the name.
That's amazing. Normally you'd see that as a URL, so it goes go here to go and get my picture. Sorry, there is a yeah yes oh yeah it'll be in bytes sort of thing. Well, it depends. Yeah exactly. But yeah yeah absolutely. So yeah yeah hopefully that answers it. Any other questions?
We'll let Matt relax now. And
When the next talk?
When's the next one? That's a
that's a
question.
very
This
good
one.
question.
Oh, that one. I haven't made it yet. I'm still making it. I'm just absolutely planning it. I've told my boss I'm making it, so I have to make it now. But it will probably be presented. I might present it here, but I'm also very keen to go and present it at ISIG as well, which is a another meetup that happens further out that way. It's more the like pen testery sort of side of security. But I mean, I think everybody's welcome for that as well. So, yeah.
Would you like to announce if it's in a different meetup? In this meetup, would you like
Yeah.
You're going to talk about another meetup to announce it to this meetup?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I can definitely make some noise about that as well. I've also
You can also follow you on Twitter.
I did have a Twitter thing somewhere. I'm very bad at using it.
You don't have to be good to use Twitter. Like,
No. I will just
even presidents can do it.
Yep. Oh, there we go. There's that. Oh, let's take a photo and whatever.
Cool.
And also my email address is there if you want to email me for reasons.
Okay. Let's thank Matt for his great talk.
That was 50 minutes.
For taking so many questions. Well done, Matt.
That's all good.
Thank you very much. I'll just end the broadcast now. Thanks for watching.